In this study, we're starting at Mark 2, verse 13, and we're going through into the next chapter to verse 6. So if you'd like to read that first, we'll then get underway. I want to take a couple of verses from the middle of this passage and let it set the tone for us. The two verses 21 and 22 about patching an old garment and reusing wineskins. This sounds rather like those angry young men of a few decades ago. It sounds like a general statement that everything old is by definition rubbish, everything that belongs to a previous generation. And the only things worth anything are the new things of our generation. Anyone can see that our parents have made a mess of the world. It's quite obvious that we're the people who are going to put things right. Perhaps you remember that angry optimism yourself. I don't think Jesus is being that angry, though, in what he's saying, or indeed that vague. In fact, the stories in the midst of which these words are set give some very specific examples of the contrast he was pointing up. So let's have a look at them. First of all, the calling of Levi in verses 13 and 14. There were two kinds of tax collectors. Those who worked directly for the Romans and collected a sort of poll tax which everyone had to pay, and those who worked on a contract. Their contract would have promised a certain sum of money to the Romans, who didn't care how they got it. These tax collectors, of which Levi was one, obviously made a living for themselves by charging more than they passed on to the Romans. It looks as if we're still in Capernaum in this story. It was an important town which was on the border between two Roman administrative areas. So these freestyle tax collectors could levy what we would call custom duties as people crossed the border carrying taxable goods, that is, which the said tax collector deemed to be taxable. There was quite a lot of scope for them to make a bit of cash in that. But we're looking at this incident for a contrast between the old and the new. Here, the old was the eminently reasonable attitude that tax collectors are them rather than us, and that enemy collaborators are just about beyond the pale. Those attitudes would have seemed reasonable in any past age that I can think of, and haven't exactly lost their appeal today. But they're old. Jesus cuts across those attitudes when he chooses Levi as a disciple. For a religious leader to allow his cause to be put at risk by taking on board someone so properly despised, that was quite an innovation. But Jesus did it, and that was new. It obviously poses a question that now that Jesus has a hated tax collector as one of his inner group, will that hamper Jesus' cause, or is his cause strong enough to take that difficulty? We'll get another version of that same question in a moment. So let's move on to verses 15 to 17 in Levi's house. An oddity, first of all. Mark says that they were reclining at the meal. That's actually obscured in NIV, if that's where you're reading from. Some books say that Jesus at this time usually sat at a table like we do. John 13:23 onwards only makes sense if Jesus was reclining immediately in front of, if John was reclining immediately in front of Jesus's chest, so that turning to speak to Jesus would have involved him in leaning back against Jesus. That means that he must have been reclining at that meal. I also wonder, as they were on their travels, going around Galilee particularly, Jesus and the disciples, were they so used to eating al fresco when there was no table to sit at all, that they were in the habit of eating that way, even when they were in a house. But there's actually a bit more to it than that. Reclining for a meal was the way that the Romans did it, and at the time of Jesus, Jews would adopt that style of eating for special occasions. So it suggests that Levi was wanting to send the message to all his guests that having Jesus there made it a special occasion, and therefore they reclined rather than sitting. It says that they were eating in his house. It doesn't make any sense to let his mean Jesus' house, so it must mean that it was Levi's house, which is how NIV takes it. In verse 15 is the first time that the group around Jesus are referred to as his disciples. We find as we read this gospel and the others that disciples is a rather vague word. We're not quite sure what it applies to in each case. Does it refer to all or some of the 12, or does it include others who were not appointed into that core group? The answer has to be yes to both of those questions. The word does both of those jobs, and it is often unclear which one it's doing when. We have to put up with that. Verse 16 has the scribes of the Pharisees. The Pharisees formed a sort of holy club or society dedicated to following all the old scriptural and traditional commandments. Some of the members of that club were trained scribes, trained interpreters of their scriptures and other documents, and they clearly played the role of helping the Pharisees to be sure that they were reading all those documents in the right way. And that probably meant that those scribes were among the strictest members of the Pharisee club. So how does the old and new issue crop up here? Well, here the old is the way that the religious establishment dealt with the population at large. They fell into the trap of creating an in-group and an out-group. The in-group were their own supporters and those who socially and economically were quite like them, and the out-group consisted of all those they couldn't really envisage joining their religious and social groupings. Tax collectors were obviously in the out-group, as were prostitutes, children, and a whole lot of less prominent people who just didn't aspire to the same levels of respectability as the Pharisees did. The Gospels often refer to the people in this out-group as sinners. That was what they were called by the in-group people. The attitude of that religious establishment then was the official voice of religion in that country. The people in the out-group heard that as what religion had to say to them. Religion told them they were out. They genuinely believed that they were out. Some of them might have had their own private ways of getting on with the Lord, like the one who comes in the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, but they never envisaged being on the in-group's terms, in the in-group's religious game. That attitude, all the bits of that, are part of the old, both the dismissive attitude of the establishment and the meekly submissive attitude of the out-group. The new which Jesus brought to that was that, facing this out-group, he was filled with a mixture of compassion and anger and seemed to go out of his way to favour them. The religious leaders, who were clearly wanting to guard their own reputations, would usually avoid any sort of contact with the out-group. But Jesus was quite happy to find himself in Levi's house at the centre of a big party at which almost all the guests were out-group people. It was unheard of for a religious leader to behave in that way. But Jesus was so sure of his own standing that he didn't have to guard his reputation in the way that other people did. He could afford to do this new thing. He was even quite cutting when he was criticised on this score. In verse 18, he's really quite aggressive and ironical in a hard way, saying to his critics, you're in the in-group that you've created. If you're completely confident that you're also in God's in-group, then don't worry. Just let me get on with rescuing some of those who lack that privilege. I'm sure that Jesus said that in such a way as to sow seeds of doubt in the Pharisees' minds as to whether they really were in God's in-group. For Jesus to put the entire religious establishment on the defensive and sow doubt in their minds as to their religious standing, that was new. I read an interesting book a little while ago about Jesus taking meals with sinners, and the official line of the religion was that by eating in the house of a Gentile or of someone else classed as a sinner, one would make oneself unclean. Their ritual uncleanness would contaminate you. You would then need to go through purification rituals to regain your usual status. But Jesus didn't have much time for the rules that made up that sort of thing in their religious system. But even more interesting than that is the probability that what Jesus thought was that the thing that could be catching in those encounters wasn't the ritual impurity of the outgroup people, but the genuine holiness of Jesus. He knew that if he spent time with people, even those in the outgroup, there was a good chance that they would be infected by God's holiness in him. That is new. So we move on to verses 18 to 22 on the subject of fasting. Verse 18, it looks as if when this question was put, it was a recognized time for fasting. So Jesus and his disciples stood out because they were not fasting. Verse 19, Jesus uses a wedding as an example of an obvious celebration and says that it's a time for feasting, not fasting. Perhaps those involved in that celebration will have cause for fasting one day, but not while they're at the wedding. Verse 21, Jesus then gives what at first seems to be a bit of folksy wisdom, that you don't repair an old garment with a piece of new unshrunk cloth. The old and the new materials behave so differently from each other that when the garment is worn, the two will probably tear apart. And in a similar vein, in verse 22, he says that you don't put new wine into old wineskins. The new wine will have too much acid in it. It needs to mature by losing that acid. It does so by eating away at the structure of the wineskin. With luck, the wineskin will last through that, and the mature wine will be available for use. But if the wineskin that you use has already done its turn in a previous season, it's very likely that it won't stay intact when assaulted by another load of acid, in which case it will burst, the wine will be lost. You'll never know whether it was a decent lot or not. This new and old theme, therefore, is fairly obvious in this, but let's follow it through. John the Baptist was a real long-haired weirdo, but he and his disciples were reassuringly conventional when compared with Jesus. I've often regarded John as the last of the Old Testament prophets, even though his story's in the New Testament. So in that sense, he was old to Jesus's new. And the incident we have in these verses concerns John's disciples. They were conventionally religious in the way they made use of fasting. And we find that makes them well and truly old. If you're impertinent enough to ask what fasting is really for, it actually starts getting remarkably difficult to get any straight answers out of anyone. You can infer one answer from what Jesus says to the inquiry here. He suggests that having him around made it too happy a time for fasting to be appropriate, and that reminds us that fasting was sometimes used as an expression of sadness, in particularly an expression of mourning, grieving. To get the rest of the picture of fasting, you need to go to people's informal attitudes rather than to any official piece of teaching. Most people would assume that those who really go in for fasting are those who are going overboard on their religion. If they were doing their GCSEs, they'd be going for a 9 grade or bust in the process. The thought of getting a 7 or 8 grade would horrify them. These are the people who don't just get on with their lives, but they spend huge amounts of energy trying to become more holy, and as a byproduct, giving the rest of us the feeling that possibly we ought to be doing the same. These people seem to use fasting as a stick to beat themselves with, as a tool with which to bring their body into submission, and they make us wonder whether really that is being more holy than we're being. The other flavour that you often get with fasting is the idea that it gives your prayers more welly. You can pray and God may take some notice of you, or you can pray and fast and God is distinctly more likely to do what you ask. I'm not at all sure that that assumption is true. It certainly seems to clash with the New Testament idea that God is motivated by his own grace, rather than by the idea that he owes you one because you're so religious. But it does seem to be what's in a lot of people's minds when they fast. I'm just reporting that, I'm not commending it. It does seem to be what a lot of people think. I'm reporting these attitudes to fasting because all of them seem to me to be a part of the old. In bringing the new, Jesus doesn't just say, don't fast. He implies that while he, the bridegroom, is around, there's simply no cause for fasting. Well, this certainly cuts across the fasting for mourning motivation, because the joy of having Jesus around makes mourning irrelevant. Oh, there was a brief period after the crucifixion and before the resurrection when such mourning was appropriate, and it could be that that's what Jesus is referring to here as the time when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. But both before that period and after it, fasting for mourning doesn't make sense. But my guess is that for a couple of days the disciples didn't eat a lot anyway. I think they were just too upset. So fasting to make yourself more acceptable to God is also an odd thing to do with Jesus around, precisely because of the way that he showed that even the most well-defined outgroupers were dearly loved by God. So why fast to bring about a condition which Jesus demonstrates is already there? And fasting to get your way with God also seems to be a bit pointless with Jesus around, because the good things of God seem to be flowing out through Jesus at such a rate that it seems pointless to put your energies into trying to persuade God to be nice to you. So, on all counts, fasting seems to be old and looks very old when Jesus is there. As old as hot pants and winkle pickers, if you like. It just doesn't seem to belong to the generation where we are. While Jesus is here, we're into the new, which makes that sort of fasting old. So let's move to the Sabbath hassle in verses 23 to the end of the chapter. The biggest issue with the old Sabbath rules was the commandment against doing work. People like the Pharisees would then have a field day deciding what would count as work. There are parts, for instance, of Golders Green when on a Saturday morning you might spot quite a number of cars parked a block or two away from the main synagogue. Their occupants would then walk the rest of the way to the meeting. The point is that there will be some people in that synagogue who count driving a car as work, and those who park at a distance simply don't want to give people like that any ammunition, so they conceal the fact that they've driven most of the way and they walk the last bit. The traditional interpretations of not working on the Sabbath restricted how far anyone could walk to something less than a mile. This incident doesn't make an issue of how far they've walked, so presumably they were within that limit. It seems that what irked the Pharisees was that the disciples were picking the odd ear of corn and threshing it between their hands before eating the grain. That threshing, in the perverted view of the Pharisees, would have to be counted as work. The fourth commandment to observe the Sabbath day was clearly old, way back in the Old Testament, but only in the sense that it was something that God had said a very long time previously. What was old in our sense was the set of regulations that Jewish religion had added to the fourth commandment to define what it meant to observe the Sabbath. And those regulations were intended to be a fence around the commandments, protecting the commandments from any threat of being broken. But they ended up as a prison in which the people were locked up, and that was old. The first way we find Jesus breaking free from some of those regulations was to compare himself with David. When David was a wandering bandit before he was king, he broke the regulations governing who should touch the bread in the sanctuary. The Jews were comfortable with that story because the way it turned out was that David became their national hero, and they granted him in retrospect the authority to break a few regulations on the way. What Jesus is saying is that one greater than David is here. Watch this space, and you will see that the way that this story turns out will show that the one who's breaking some little Sabbath regulations at the moment is the one who put the fourth commandment there in the first place. Religion makes its regulations and shows itself as old. Jesus comes along with an authority greater than that of any of those regulations, and is refreshingly new. Religion will try to squash him or to domesticate him, but it must not succeed. The old must not get away with stifling the new. We're reading just the first 6 verses of chapter 3 now, which is where we move to now, because that's continuing the Sabbath theme, so we might as well do it while that's what's in the air. It would be possible to read the events there in chapter 3 as happening in the synagogue back in Capernaum later on the same Sabbath to which the last verses in chapter 2 apply. If so, then some sort of cumulative effect is possible in the mind of the Pharisees. That is, when they asked Jesus about fasting, they could have been genuinely wanting an account of his spirituality in order to compare it with their own. They assumed that they were clearly more religious and therefore knew better, but their question wasn't openly aggressive. Out in the fields, they thought they were on safer ground and were probably miffed that Jesus had an answer for them. So by the time they got to the synagogue, they were getting tired of Jesus coming up with an answer for everything. And verse 2 in chapter 3 suggests that they'd become decidedly more aggressive. And verse 6 shows that they had the makings of a plot to kill him. Even if the events that we've been reading in this study did not happen on the same Sabbath like that, that progression of attitude on the scribes' part, on the Pharisees' part, is still there. So let's look at verse 1 of chapter 3. Notice it says here that he went into the synagogue. I think we can assume that the disciples were with him still, but the action in the synagogue really centred entirely on Jesus. The disciples were still at this stage watching what he did, trying to learn from it, rather than necessarily doing it with him. The account here reads as if Jesus was in the congregation rather than preaching, but he's still the focus of what was happening. We're not told what drew Jesus' attention to the man with the withered hand, but that doesn't matter. The important thing is what he did about it. First of all, Jesus got the man to stand up. He wasn't going to try and hide what he was doing. Verse 4. Before ministering to the man, Jesus addressed his opponents, and later in the story it says they were in fact Pharisees. He clearly knew that they were going to attack him for healing someone on the Sabbath, because their regulations permitted a healing on the Sabbath if someone was likely to die before the end of the Sabbath, or if it was a woman giving birth. But other healings were counted as doing work, which could wait until at least after sunset, when it was no longer Sabbath. So Jesus didn't give them a chance to voice their objections. He decided to shoot first. And what he said was exploring the motivation behind their Sabbath regulations. Were they trying to promote good or promote evil? The saving of life or the ending of it? I suspect that the opponents he had there knew that there was little point in their arguing with him. He was so much better at such arguments than they were, so they kept stum. Jesus allowed himself to show that he was really angry at their attitude, or possibly more precisely at the attitude of the system of which they were representatives, and he proceeded to heal the man's hand. Verse 6. It wasn't, of course, that the Pharisees didn't have a response to Jesus, just that they saw no point in voicing it in an argument with him. What they did instead was to start plotting his demise. They even found some unlikely conspirators in some supporters of King Herod Antipas, the Roman appointee over Galilee. So let's again review the old and the new. Jesus is faced with the old of those Sabbath regulations in both of those Sabbath incidents. This time his counter to them is different. He simply shows that they don't make sense. There's no good logic in holding up one day as better than all other days and then objecting when really good things happen on that day. Doesn't make sense. The regulations put together by religion do tend to grow like topsy. At best they're created by a committee. At worst they're put together by a committee which has been sitting for so many hundreds of years that it's completely forgotten what rhyme or reason there was in some of its earlier decisions. And the result is that religious tradition is covering over a basic lack of coherence. That's old. When Jesus is around, you expect to find things hanging together properly, to have integrity. That's new. Verses 21 and 22 again in chapter 2 remind us of where our conclusion is heading. If you're trying to take the new things that you find in Jesus and the new thing that indeed is Jesus, and try making that all a part of the old system of religion, it won't work. The life that is in Jesus will burst out of the container that is the old religion, and the authority of Jesus is anyway higher than that which created the religion in the first place. So why should he be confined within that religion and its ways? And that becomes particularly clear when we get towards the end of the story, to the resurrection. One of my lecturers in university said once that the only worldview which can cope with the resurrection of Jesus is a worldview which begins with the resurrection. Any other worldview is old. Only something which is formed in the light of Jesus has any chance at all of being new. Only such a new view of things has any chance of coping with Jesus himself. Well, we've been looking at a story of something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago, and of the old-new contrast which was shown up then. I don't have to say, do I, that the same issue is with us today. Nothing's really changed. The same mechanisms are producing the same old things, and they might be wearing new hats, but they're still essentially the same. They might be wearing Christian hats rather than Jewish ones, And the same issue holds that where Jesus is, there we have something new, and something which must be put in its own container, not in one of the old ones. The container, of course, that you need to be most interested in is your own life. If you try to take hold of Jesus and contain him within your life, does your life qualify as old that will never manage to contain Jesus, or as new, which has been remade precisely for the purpose of hosting Jesus? I'll leave that one with you, because that brings us to the end of this episode of our study.